In a war of attrition, nothing goes to waste. Not even the original revolver of a later more famous Belgian arms maker. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Belgian revolver model 1878, the original military nagant. Now I know it's a bit hard to see from this distance, so let's get a closer look at the light box. Weighing a whopping 2½ pounds and with an overall length of 10½ inches, this is a beefy handgun. It loads the 9.4mm Nagant cartridge one at a time through a right-hand gate. 6 shots in total. Now, I know a lot of you have been looking forward to this show for a while, and you're likely more familiar with the Russian Nagant 1895, but this is its granddaddy and was still in service during the Great War, so luckily we'll get to give it a good deep dive today. Our story will start, however, with the brothers Nagant. Emile Nagant was born in 1830, son of a Belgian lawyer Charles-Joseph Lambert Nagant. They had a lot of names back then. Sadly, I found very little on Emile's early years. Instead, all I can really say is that in 1859, he started a modest business, one in which he invited his younger brother Henri Léon to join him, both as an investor and partner in the enterprise. Together they formed what was started as a metal fabrication and parts repair factory, but being located in Liège, they soon began working on, well, you guessed it, firearms. Why else would they be on our show today? Most notably, they would, tinker around with the Dutch 1873 revolver, and to what capacity, however, I am unsure. It's been suggested that they had a hand in development, or manufacture of parts, or repair. All that matters for now is that they did interact with this handgun and its 9.4mm cartridge. While that will come back around later, to see the Nagant brothers get started in actual firearms production for sure, we'll first have to take a look at a rifle, an American one. We've covered the Remington rolling block in an earlier episode, but to review quickly, this single-shot black powder breech loader was a huge success and saw worldwide sales in the military market. The sons Remington took themselves and their rifle to Europe in 1867, and while touring, made the acquaintance of the Nagant, who had become quite good at working with firearms, but did not have a design all to their own. Well, I think you can guess where this is going. It just makes good business sense. Yep, we're an arms company now. The Remingtons took a look around the Nagant factory and found a competent European partner, and just in time, because Pope Pius IX was struggling to preserve the Papal States in the face of Italian unification. The Holy See was under armed siege and would need a modern rifle for its troops. At first, this would be the French Chassepot, but experience quickly led to the adoption of the Remington rolling block instead, a slightly more modern rifle. Having a manufacturer nearer to hand in Belgium would speed up shipping for sure, and could open up the European market further for Remington, who could take a simple profit through licensing their designs. The Nagant brothers would be their agents, and Samuel Remington himself would help set up production in Liège. 10,000 guns were ordered in total. Half would be made in Belgium by Nagant, with funds raised from Belgian Catholics. The rest were actually made by Wesley Richards in England, with funds from the United Kingdom. These contracts were not, however, finished by the time of the capture of Rome in 1870. So those that were delivered, well, they would be taken by the Italians and later sold to Ethiopia. While the Nagant rolling blocks couldn't save the Papal States, they did provide quite a bit of income for, well, the Nagants, who continued to produce this design for a number of decades, and by 1869, they would begin to develop their own patented changes to the overall rifle. Actually, this pattern would evolve for a number of years, resulting in some truly original design work by the Nagants. They would develop simple rolling block shotguns, followed by rolling block double barrels, which they did set up a trigger system that revolved around a single trigger to operate both barrels. That means that you could fire one barrel, then the other, without having to find a second place for your booger hook. They would take this idea over to a handgun in 1877. That's right, a double-barreled rolling block handgun. This was adopted by the Belgian gendarmerie and would be their first centerfire pistol. It used a 9.4mm cartridge adapted from the Dutch 1873, this time with a 22mm case. The round and load were likely developed by the Bachmann Ammunition Company at the request of the brothers Nagant. This was, of course, still in the days of black powder. Also in 1877, February specifically, Emile Nagant patented his first revolver. I have not, however, found that document. I am extremely frustrated by it actually because it does appear to describe what would become the Dutch police revolver. Sadly, I can't be sure, but I would not be surprised, as we'll see it's the same sort of cylinder locking concept that's applied to a later Nagant revolver. While this first gun is mired in some confusion, we know a lot more about Emile's second. The patent for this gun would be filed in Belgium in August of 1877, and it appears to have been tailored to an ongoing military trial, which had technically been in effect since 1869. You see, the Belgian army, and especially the cavalry, were still hanging on to percussion cap pistols. This is not ideal in the modern metallic cartridge era. Technically, the Chamelot-Delvigne had won the initial competition in 1871, but in actually selecting a cartridge and finalizing plans for productions, problems just kept arising with the whole system. So the Belgians kept on with the search, and by 1876 they were getting more serious about this issue. It had really dragged on too long. They settled in on the Gendarmerie's 9.4mm Nagant cartridge, which they found to be reasonably powerful with mild controllable recoil. It also gave excellent accuracy and reasonable power out to 50 meters. With ammunition selected, they came up with a list of necessary features for their next service revolver. In addition to chambering that 9.4mm cartridge, these guns would have to do the following: have a fixed barrel that cannot be unscrewed. The ejector rod must be locked into place firmly during firing. They dictated the rifling pattern, that sights must be set for 20 meters. The firing pin must be a milled component of the hammer and not a separate piece. And that hammer plus the cylinder must be made of Bessemer steel, basically a particularly hard and strong steel. That would make a lot of sense in an era when iron frames and parts were still fairly common. 8 guns managed to fulfill these demands and were tested. I sadly do not know which, but I suspect names like Chamelot-Delvigne, Francot, Galland, and others were in play. Their inventors would partner with a commission member to show how to disassemble the guns for cleaning. They would also disassemble them completely for measurement of any possible parts that may wear during firing. Then a series of shooting tests for accuracy, penetration, and sustained fire were conducted. These were done from 10 to 40 meters and over 200 rounds for each gun. After that, 6 shots were taken with intentionally damaged cartridges. This was in order to see if not only would they operate with damaged cartridges, but also the effect of any leaking gas that may have an effect on the shooter. 4 out of the 8 submissions survived. After the first round of testing, the remaining inventors took another pass at improving their designs, and this is where we get the major patent that we know for the Nagant revolver. It's a fairly simple system for the time, close to the Chamelot-Delvigne, but with a Warnant-style hammer nose. The original design included a quick disassembly feature in the form of a sweet trigger guard that actually eases how you handle the main springs. The fearsome foursome return, and I am still not sure who is there outside of Nagant, and there's a bit of a reason for that. Most of the selection committee didn't know what guns they were shooting either. You see, these guns were produced without manufacturer's marks by request, and they were merely assigned a number from 1 to 4. 4 envelopes were prepped with the corresponding numbers on the outside and the manufacturer's name written on the inside, and in this way there could be no bias for your favorite Liège gunmaker. All 4 guns were again given basic tests, then extreme endurance tests for weather, rust, and complete lack of cleaning over multiple days. Only 1 was knocked out in this first round. The remaining 3 were ordered in batches of 10 for further trials. Again, more rough handling. 1 was actually disqualified in this period for failing a drop test, having discharged from a height of, I believe, like 10 feet. Finally down to 2, all right? So in the final round, number 2 of the original 4 finally fails out, not because of any one problem, but because of poor batch manufacture. There's just too much variance in fit and performance from one to the next of those 10 that were made for the trial. So the number 3 revolver won, and the number 3 envelope was opened, revealing, well, I mean, the Nagant. That's the title of the episode. I'm surprised you're surprised by this. It's no small feat, though. The Nagant had cleared 1,200 rounds with only 2 misfires, and those were caused by just plain dead primers. It had also been unanimously preferred by the entire testing committee, offering excellent strength, handling, accuracy, and quality of fit and finish. So the Nagant would be adopted by royal decree in June of 1878, making it, of course, the Model 1878. And that's our gun here today, the one that's conveniently in my hand. So maybe we should take a closer look. Hey, this is a fancy looking gun, right guys? Let's take a look over here. Now the first thing I want to point out, and I know I'm skipping a little bit ahead, but let me get a Russian Nagant in here. That's a lot bigger, all right? I just want you guys to understand the scale. We'll get into why later, but this is a larger handgun than you would initially think if you've handled a Nagant before. So very big, very beautiful. These would have been high polish, high blue. This one's gotten a little old, but you can still see that it's kind of shiny, right? Well, if we look at how the gun works, we have a single and double action revolver. We have a gate loader with no ABITI system or anything like that. It's just, I mean, we're locked up, not really. See, pop and go. So you're gonna have to manually index and load each individual cartridge, and it's kind of slow, right? But at least very sturdy, very stable, very strong with that full top strap. Fixed rear sight, kind of a low rounded front sight so that it doesn't snag in any sort of holster. And we have, probably very interestingly, we have wood grips that actually go all the way to the back. So we have a wood back strap, wood on both sides, and then we even have some wood relief in the front. This gives very good positive grip for that time. There's no slipping of the pinky at the front. There's no slipping of the palm at the back. This is a very nice grip feel. I honestly, with my very large mitts, really prefer this gun. It's beautiful feeling and points very well. So you'll notice that we also have, for unloading, an ejector rod at the front. You pull it out, you roll it over the side. You would obviously already have your gate open. If you wanted to get rid of a spent casing, punch it out with the rod. And then when you were done, this folds back and away. Now the rod is retained by a spring. See if you guys can see that there. Let me get my patented plastic and pokey. Right there, that little guy is putting tension on this rod so it doesn't just sort of slide forward under its own power. It takes a little bit of a pull. In terms of disassembly, the gun gets fairly interesting. It has a rapid cylinder takedown, and then you have to use a screw to get into the lock work. So for the cylinder, you pull the rod out, move it over to the side, and then, I'm not sure how well you guys can see this, it's very small, but there is a push button right here built into this central axis pin. So if I push on the side and pull on the whole thing, she'll come out. If I open up my gate on the other side, my cylinder comes away nice and easy. 6 shots, pretty straightforward cylinder. Nothing fancy there other than some very pretty fluting. That's just to reduce the weight of the overall gun without hopefully compromising too much of the strength. So if I get the gun back in here, we can look at the lock work. Basically off of one particular screw on this side. So let me get a hollow ground screwdriver of appropriate size, and I will fit that into this screw of all screws, and I'm just going to rotate that guy out. It's riveting television. So with that screw away, generally you'll see Mark or myself go ahead and tap on the sides of these guns. Because of the age, I have a slightly better tapper. I go nice and light. I use the soft side. I'm just using a little extra mass because it gets it done a bit faster. So tap, 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 tap. And then at the edges of the front, tap, 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 tap. I'm just making sure she's nice and loose so I don't have to fight her. And then I can get a fingernail in there and start to open her up. She pops free. So there we go. We get her back in frame so you can see that action. I think I have a fair bit of glare, so see what I can do to position that. We'll have an animation in a moment if you can't make it out perfectly, but right there's the operation of our gun. So we have a set of springs. One is the main, one for the trigger. I'm doing this off my little monitor. We have a sort of sear engagement at the bottom of the hammer. We do, however, also have a nose for our double action. So if we go to single action, you'll see the engagement right at the top rear of the, sorry folks, trying to see what I'm doing. Engagement right here at the end of the hammer, again, easier to see in the animation. And then if I pull the trigger, that'll release. My own loading gate's in my way, sorry folks. And then for double action, it's just gonna lift up on the nose, just like you would expect in a modern single or double action gun. It's just that we have the extra spring in there and the extra sort of sear engagement here, like we've seen on like Chamelots and things like that. So we've got trigger spring up front, a sear spring, I should say, and a main spring. So 1, 2, 3. That count's gonna be important for later. Just make sure you understand the complexity of it. While we're in here, I want to show you something really cool about this design, which is that this screw here holds in the front of the trigger guard, and the rear is actually on a hinge pin. So if I release this without scratching anything up, hopefully, and she's a little snug. Let me see if I'm out of threading yet. No, not quite. Yeah, she's out of thread now. The thing is, it's under spring tension, and there's a good reason for that. So give me 1 second to pop that guy out with a little bit of a flick. Oh, I say a little bit of a flick, and then I need a large flick. You notice me struggling, and there's a reason. Because that trigger guard is actually resisting these 2 springs back here, and it's resisting this 3rd spring up here. So 1, 2, 3 springs being compressed by that trigger guard being pulled up and then set with that 1 screw like a pin. And if I let it out, I've let out the tension on all the major springs in the system. So that means that I can just pop these guys out. And a lot of you guys that might have worked on revolvers before understand that it can be a real bear to clamp and get a spring set down there. There's all sorts of systems for that. This system's remarkable because the gun itself helps you with reassembly. As a matter of fact, on these 78s, there's actually texturing right here. See that guy? It's texturing right there so that you can even hold your grip and recompress 1, 2, and all 3 springs, really get on it, hold it tight with one hand, and then shove this guy in with the other. I'm not gonna attempt that right now directly on camera, but you get the idea. This is actually a huge step. This really does help you set up a revolver much faster for reassembly. It's pretty cool. Now, before I get this thing all the way out, I want to show you one last little feature, which is actually on the cover. And I may have to get you a zoomed in picture because I doubt you can see it too clearly, but right here on the cover, you're gonna see the crest of King Leopold II. So that's how you know it's a nice military 1878. Okay, so while I reassemble this without having to mug for a camera, let's get a closer look at actually how this works, because I know it's a bit crowded in there. It's very hard to see from the camera. That's why we have Bruno in one of his magnificent animations to show us how this early Nagant works. This is a gate loader, so we will have to place these cartridges one by one. Starting in single action, we'll manually cock back the hammer until its rearmost notch snags the sear. Pull the trigger to tip that sear, and the hammer drops, discharging the round. That sear does have its own dedicated flat spring. Now note the hand, which indexes the cylinder and requires its own spring as well. Switching to double action, we can just pull the trigger through, which catches the nose of the hammer, tilting it back until it's released to discharge the round. Note the trigger also has its own V-spring, as does the nose. The hammer is powered by the large V-shaped mainspring, which works on the hinged spur. Ejection is manual, so swing out the rod and start punching. Alright, let's go see how it shoots. I'm not gonna lie, this thing is about as close as I've gotten to Smith & Wesson Smooth from a European revolver. With the model 1878 selected, production would follow just a few months later. There were some final details about steel quality and things like that to hammer out. The guns cost the Belgians 55 francs a pop, a fairly hefty sum for that time. With the adoption, the Nagant spun up a new company name, one to carry the contract and market their new line of Marshall revolvers. These 1878s, by the way, were meant for cavalry and officers only. High polish, finely fit. These are luxury guns almost. As far as production numbers, I couldn't turn up anything. The 78 was likely the most produced Belgian Marshall Nagant, and I do have data for the remaining models, but sadly, likely due to poor records and many private purchases, I'm unsure of how many of these guns are out there. Of course, I did say that there were other models, so I'm probably going to have to define those, starting with this, the Model 1883 Lightbox. The length, cartridge, capacity, and loading method are all the same. The weight is actually a teeny bit reduced, but this gun is single action only, a European cowboy 6-shooter. So how exactly did we take a step backwards? Well, it's actually a strange leap forwards, sort of. First things first, I should probably tell you that around 1878, Léon's sons Charles and Maurice started taking an active interest in the business. It's been suggested they may have had a hand in the evolution of the design, although I'm betting not for reasons that we're going to see next episode. Instead, I think Emile was still hard at work trying to solve a pressing problem, selling more revolvers. You see, he was aware that the Belgian government wasn't in a hurry to drop a lot of cash on handguns, and yet plenty of troops still needed them. NCOs, field artillery, rail guards, things like that. So what he needed was a cheaper gun, and one that appealed to a certain distrust of the enlisted men's intelligence. So, in March of 1880, the firm patented a new, simpler lockwork for their revolver. And when I say simple, I really mean it. This gun was now using the bare minimum number of parts, and I'm quite sure I've now found the inspiration for that Italian Bodeo that we talked about so long ago. The Belgian army loved it. Same everything, less money, and fairly insulting to the intelligence of the lower class. Everything you'd really want. So the gun was adopted in 1883, and that's this gun here. So let's take a closer look at just what I've got in my hand. Okay, first things first, this guy is plain. Now I know he looks shinier because he's in better shape, but this is a very dull, flat bluing versus this very high polished bluing that's just happened to wear out over the years. In terms of scale, the guns are identical. I mean, if you were blindfolded and handed one than the other, you would never know the difference. The grips feel great, they point well, the weight's about the same. In terms of operation, everything's the same again. We have a gate loader, we have a pull and swing out ejector rod. In terms of utility, nothing is different except for the fact that I can no longer do this. Nothing. I got bupkis. Instead, you have to manually cock and then drop the hammer. So single action only. This is a cowboy style gun. And again, that's an economy measure. So in terms of economy, by the way, we have no fancy King Leopold crest. Instead, we only ever end up with some regimental markings here at the front and some basic serial numbers and things like that. There's no checkering or any fanciness on the trigger guard. And then in terms of the actual function of the gun, if I start to take it apart, we'll see one pretty big difference, which is that on the original design, there was a fear that if you were reloading the gun pitched forward like this key, this central axis pin might work itself free, and that's why they had that push button lock. Well, obviously that's not a huge risk because this ain't going anywhere. I mean, I can shove it out, but if I sit here, I mean, it's not moving a lick. And even if it did, I would just sort of tap it back in a little bit and keep going with myself. I'd notice. So they went ahead and dished that locking button on there. So that's a lot of parts saved. And you just sort of push this pin out and the cylinder will free as soon as I open up the gate. So cylinder's out of the way. No fluting, no fanciness on the cylinder. This is not trying to save any weight. It's just a brutalist design. So put that away. We will spend less money and carry around a heavier gun. Now, for disassembly on the gun itself, it's the same as it ever was. we have a screw right here. And by the way, both of these guns disassembly screws are marked A, so I assume that that's an indicator, but I'm not sure what word it stands for. So I'm gonna get this guy out. And disassembly is gonna be just the same. I'll pull the screw, I'll tap the gun. Let me see if she's gonna, help to not lose my bit. She's opened up a teeny bit, let's see. This one is extremely tight, so I am going to work my way around just carefully so I don't scratch anything. And then I'm gonna find a spot where I can get the screwdriver in and just give it a little bit of a pry. And careful not to damage the edges of the finish. You don't wanna crank on any of the stuff. It will come loose if you get it evenly broken free all the way around and then lift straight off. So we're in, and this is a radically different gun than the one that we just saw. We are down to one spring. Because it's single action, we don't even have the V spring for the nose. We don't have a trigger spring because this one main spring is pressing up on the hammer and then back down on the trigger, and there's a wraparound to help it kind of put some pressure up on the hand. That is everything. So let's count the parts, shall we? Trigger, mainspring, hammer, hand. That's it for the entire lock work of this gun. And then you take into account the cylinder, which is one piece, one shape. Yeah, this is as dead simple a revolver as you're gonna get. It is a fantastically sublime design and interestingly very smooth. So manually cock it back, pull the trigger, and that's gonna release, and she's free to fall. And I know I'm in my own way. Let me do that again. And you can watch her disengage and drop. That's it, guys. There's nothing fancier than that. I will say, however, because of the setup of the spring, we get one very big advantage over the original 1878. So let me show you something. If I cock this guy back and then fire her, watch the hammer carefully. I'm trying to do this without just dropping her on myself. There we go. Tell you watch the hammer carefully and then I cover it, right, guys? Drop the hammer. Hammer is now flush, right to the back of the frame. Release, nada. There is a step back position, a rebound position that I manually must click to, right? This gun, see where that hammer is resting? I'm gonna get her back. I'm gonna let her forward. And let me get her to drop all the way. Oops, sorry guys, I'm gonna pop and, good Lord. 1 second. I've got parts that are stepping out of the frame. There we go. Back, and then drop to fire all the way down. I'm holding the trigger. I let go of the trigger. Yeah, automatic rebound, a Warrant style rebound. That is a definite improvement over the 78, despite being a single action only. And that's why I say sort of an odd gun. Now, if you notice, the trigger guard has changed. There's none of that checkering, but it still has a crossbolt style screw. And in both these guns, when you unscrew this, the first bit is unthreaded so that you can set it like a pin and then screw it into tighten. That makes it very easy for you to set the main spring and release the main spring tension by just rotating across this axis here. Same as the earlier one, they just tucked it further back because there's no longer the V spring for the trigger there. Really cool design, really simple design. Even if you don't want to go around shooting single action all the time, this is great. All right. So it's so simple, I just don't feel like I need to show you guys an animation. I don't know what I would tell you that I didn't just show you like this. So instead of putting all that effort there, let's just go ahead and load up a couple extra 9.4mm cartridges that may take a burn with the single action only. You know, bit of a setback on the single action, but this is a very smooth trigger pull. Now, only about 3,300 of these babies were produced. I've heard tales of a few having fluted cylinders for special troop purchases, but I haven't seen an example to confirm. The new simplified system had worked and sold more guns, but eventually the Belgian army would be back for more single and double actions, triple actions. They wanted to keep the costs lower than the original 78 though, and that's gonna make this gun, the model 7886, a simplification of the original 78 using the principles from the 83. Let's get into the light box. Same length, same cartridge, same count, same loading, double and single action, but we did lose a tiny bit of weight. That's because we have a simpler action and the cylinder flutes. It's pretty cool. Before we go too deep on this one, I should say that by about the time that this gun was adopted, Emile Nagant was going blind, and so his younger brother was starting to take over the bulk of development. How much of that went into the 1886 is a bit uncertain, but what we see after this is mostly the work of Leon. All right, so this is gonna mean that it's pretty much time for another zoom in because there's not a lot of history between the 83 and this one. Let's take a closer look. Now, the fair comparison for this gun is actually our old 1878. And in that regard, externally, they are very close. Besides the cylinder flutes, and if you're paying very, very, very close attention to the existence of that little button up there, they're near identical. I mean, you'd be forgiven for not noticing. As a matter of fact, if we flip this guy around, we still have, and I know the light's atrocious, we still have our Leopold II crest right here. So, fantastic. The finish is a lot better than the dull finish on the 83, but not as high quality as what was originally on the old 78. Again, this one's worn more than its later descendant. So oval flutes is usually the giveaway for these guys instead of the flutes straight out the front. A little bit more reinforcement at the mouth. They may have been working with a slightly hotter loading for that 9.4 by this time because we're getting into the smokeless era. Now, if I take this gun and we take it apart like we have so many others, again, I'm just going to do the rod. I'm going to push out the key. Nothing has changed from the 83 in this regard. It's just stiff as ever. No chance of losing that. And then open up the gate, which is stiff on this gun. Get that guy out of there. And once more, I have a screw marked with the letter A for ha. So we'll unscrew that. This is the most riveting part of the entire episode. Recommend somebody compile a nice little shot of me just unscrewing things. So once more, we have to tap. Let's see what we get. Hey, good one. So set that aside and there we go. We are inside the action, and this should look very similar to that previous 1883. We have our main spring, which is powering the hammer directly. We are rebounded, so again, if I were to do this and pull the trigger, hold on. It never wants to drop all the way down once I've opened her up because the hammer likes to slip off and tie up and hit the side of the frame. That's what keeps happening to me. So if I get that guy back, and down all the way, and then watch it, rebound. All right, that is an excellent little feature. It keeps you from dragging across the back of those cases when you index, or if this thing starts to roll, because there is no cylinder stop. These things will roll position whenever you are between shots. So, I mean, not unless you put some outside force on it, but that's a risk that we talked about on that old Japanese Type 26 revolver. So, one main spring, no trigger spring, that's powered by the same main spring. The only additional spring to this entire system is the one now in the nose because there's a small V spring in there to power the spring tension for the nose of the hammer. That's to enable the use of double action. So check out this cool trick. I can just pull the trigger and she will go ahead and cock and drop that hammer all on her own. And I'm gonna tell you guys, this is very smooth. That's pretty dang cool, right? This is definitely where the Bodeo got most of its design choices. More on that in a moment. So we still have our easy disassemble, reassemble trigger guard where we pop the one screw, this swings down, detensions that mainspring. So Other than that, not a lot of changes, but this is the heart of the modern Nagant action. This is the action that will go forward into the Russian 1895 with additional parts added on top of it. Now, because this is distinctly different, I want to make sure you understand it, so we will take this one over to an animation and get a closer look. Again, we are dealing with a gate loader, one round at a time. However, the action is much simpler in this gun. Cocking the hammer causes it to engage a notch at the back of an extension on the trigger. Pulling the trigger frees it. The mainspring now powers both the hammer and trigger and stabilizes the hand. Here we see it resting on a notch cut in the rotating pin of the hand. Pulling the trigger tips its extension into the nose, pushing the hammer back, until it slips free, dropping and discharging the round. On release, the trigger extension slips back past the nose thanks to it being hinged in one direction, and held in place by a lighter V-spring. When you release the trigger, an extension pushes the hammer to the rear, acting as the rebound. So yeah, this whole system goes from 5 total springs to just 2. Ejection is the same, 1 round at a time. Alright, let's get this over to Mae for another demonstration. This has been 1, 2, and I'm out of hands, 3 revolvers in one episode. I think that's a record for our show. Now, previously we had an episode where I wondered where the heck the Bodeo came from, because I didn't trust such a sublime action to come from seemingly nowhere. I mean, that is about the simplest possible single and double action I have seen that then included a hammer block. Well, I am now betting it was 90% Nagant and maybe a little 10% Galland inspired. That Galland bit is probably why we did have to use the hammer block, because as far as I've been able to experiment with this guy, that hammer isn't going anywhere, even from a real big blow at the back. Now, these guns were still used by officers, and they were adopted by the Garde Civique cavalry, plus customs got in on the action, and actually they represented 1/3 of all of the 86s produced. This gun is actually one of those, and you can tell because they wrote it on the frame right here. Total production of all 1886s is roughly 2,800 units, so these are not super plentiful guns. I'm glad to have all 3 of these in one place. Belgian Nagant are quite rare. That's it, by the way, just these 3 for now. We're not going on to the next one until next episode. So what about service life? Well, funny thing about Belgium, it's neutral. So not a lot for these guns to get into outside of some private purchases, making it into the Congo, although that's a whole other mess. So really, these guns mostly stayed quiet until they were replaced by the FN 1900. We've already discussed this Browning design that practically defined the automatic handgun in a previous episode. These little 32s were way handier and much faster firing than the old 1878 and 86s, and they had almost completely displaced them by the time war were declared. Yep, and as we know, it was one of attrition, and Belgium especially took it on the nose. I think we know plenty enough of the German invasion by this point, and in the hurry to arm as many troops as possible, all of the Nagant revolvers were pressed into wider service. Now, all three designs could be found with warrant officers, NCOs, artillerymen, or just plain trumpeteers. Sadly, all of that confusion means it's pretty hard to track down an account of these guns being used in battle. I'm pretty sure no one would be super happy with the 83 though. Single action only doesn't seem like something I'd be stoked about in the middle of World War I when the machine gun was emerging, but the 78 and 86 were both reasonably accurate, easily handled guns, just a bit heavy and the cartridge is a little slow moving. Even so, 9.4 does inspire more confidence than 32 ACP for some officers. Still, these guns could be found both in the rear and up front at the beginning of the war. As time went by, however, they slowly walked out of service, mostly thanks to limited supply of ammunition. Belgium simply bought every commercial 1900 they could lay hands on, and also contracted for Colt 1903s, keeping the readily available 32 ACP cartridge standard, and not electing to chase down more 9.4mm ammo. I actually tried looking to see if there was a smokeless version of that cartridge, and I didn't have much luck getting an answer. It's likely Belgium just used their stockpiled reserves of ammo and then made the jump exclusively to 32. They did not, however, remove them entirely from service. The Belgian gendarmerie would still carry these guns until 1940. Belgium wouldn't be the only country to adopt the large frame Nagant revolvers, by the way. The 1886 style of gun would be particularly preferred abroad, seeing really small purchases in Norway and then more normal contracts in Luxembourg and Brazil. Mind you, these are all the larger frame patterns. We are not talking about the smaller, newer one yet. We'll talk next time about that, as a matter of fact. It was shrunk, and there's going to fill out a little bit more of that atlas for how many people adopted it, but that's for another day. Instead, for now, we're going to take these three guns, and we're going to bring Mae in and get her opinion on all of them and how they handled. All right, once more, we've made room for Mae, and this time we have 3 revolvers. Is that a record? I think so.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, so I've got them laid out on the table in order for you guys. Now, from us, it's left to right. For you, it's right to left. We have the 78, we have the single action only 83, and then we have the improved 1886. So try to bear that in mind in case we get to gesturing, but we'll try to keep count the names out loud to avoid confusion. But you have 3 guns to tell us about. And we were just talking about this before the show, and you said that you kind of felt like they're pretty similar, so we could have batched them for the first little bit, and then we'll break out and talk about their differences. So when we're talking about ergonomics with a Belgian revolver, what is it that we're getting?
When you go to pick these up and you think you're picking up a Nagant, it is a big Nagant. It's not like the itty-bitty Russian one that I'm used to. No, these things are huge, and they weigh a ton. They're just big overall when you handle one. It's definitely unexpected. Now, for all of them across the board, I would say they're all very similar. Of course, they have some distinct differences, in which we'll get into those in a bit. But for a lot of those similarities, they're all gate loaders, so they're all going to be very slow to load. They all have the same cartridge, so it's the 9.4, and it is going to be a black powder. We decided to play it safe with these guys. We wanted to make sure that we...
Yeah, a note on that. The military cartridges of the time, and I get this comment a lot, probably weren't as smoky as the black powder that we have available to us now for this loading, but the reason we go with black powder as much as possible on these guns is because if we do not know of a military switch to smokeless, we want to be very careful about pressure curves. This is how a lot of, I believe, Lee guns have gotten blown up, is because people load to the same PSI, but there's a big difference between me pushing on Mae with 5 pounds of force and me punching Mae with 5 pounds of force. And that's all the difference to that cylinder wall. And so be careful, guys. Just because you've gotten the same pressure doesn't mean that you have an equivalent cartridge in terms of what it's going to do to a period revolver or other firearm. So black powder as much as possible.
Now, it is possible that the single action could have handled it because that cylinder does not have any fluting on it, but we still wanted to play it safe with all of them.
Yeah, we're not sure where the metallurgy was tested to, but I agree. That is a much more massive cylinder on particularly the single action because it has not been lightened or reduced in diameter at all. So, okay. Generally, you say they're all very big. I think they weigh like 2.5 pounds each. I think the 86 was ever so slightly lighter, but I don't know that you can perceive that.
You really honestly can't, especially when we were on range that day. To be honest, and we'll mention this, I think we haven't talked about this yet, but we had been shooting several revolvers that day. That was the day of the gassers and the Montenegrins as well as the Nagants.
Yes, and the Montenegrin had a habit of locking its cylinder, and then you'd have to manually index it. And so until we learned that lesson, poor Mae had been destroying her hands for probably about 4 hours before she picked these guns up. So I know a lot of you are going to say there's a little shake, there's a little fatigue. They're not as hard to use as they look. Her accuracy could have been higher. She was probably as close to hand. I mean, imagine opening 40 pickle jars, I think, is where you were at by the time you picked these guns up. So
I'd say that's pretty spot on. Pickle jar number 41 is a bit difficult.
yeah. So you were tired, but they still looked like you did fine, right? All shots on paper, so they can't be that bad. But let's get back into it. Ergonomically, is there any difference between these three?
So honestly, if you were to blindfold me and hand me any one of these three revolvers, there is only one of them I could tell perceivably was different from the others, and that would be the single action, the 83, because that one, honestly, that grip is incredibly long. And that's really the only way I'd be able to tell. The other two, the 78 and the 86, there'd be no way for me to tell the difference between those just being handed them with my eyes closed.
I didn't even notice it till she told it to me earlier, that the 83 actually does have perhaps, I mean, it's very hard for you guys to see at home. It's only about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch of extra grip, but I guess it was there to help with that rocking in the hand for the single action. So yeah, it exceeds my big meaty mid. I mean, I've got 3/4 of an inch in the wind, even when with my hand fully wrapped around and tucked in. So it's an impressively sized grip for a gun like this, and it does not feel like what you would think of as a Nagant. So otherwise, though, you'd say weight, pointing. What about the sights? How are they doing?
Honestly, the sights on all three of them are incredibly tall. That was definitely unexpected. So it was fantastic. I never really had any trouble lining up my sights with any one of these three. Now, granted, if you handed me all three and I only looked down the sights, there'd be no difference for me. I really couldn't tell the difference between any of them just from the sight perspective.
Yeah, I feel like the Nagant revolvers do a good job of proving the point that you can have a very tall, positive sight on an old revolver and have them not snag in a holster. They're very smooth. They're very rounded over. They're very easy to work with. I don't see them snagging on anything, and I still get a very positive look down the sights when I look down the sights with them. So, okay, well, I guess ergonomically big, kind of awkward with loading and unloading, full grips, fairly long pull, I guess, if you think about the distance between the trigger and your finger. Did you have any difficulty with that?
I did notice it most definitely. Honestly, I noticed it on it. If you look at my finger, it can just barely reach past the trigger guard on this, which, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's just, I'm losing a little bit of purchase on that when it is just that far away, especially when I'm having to pull some of these for double action.
Yeah, and I think that's leading into what we're talking about for the triggers, because I know it looked like she had enough room to get the job done, but these are fairly heavy triggers with some slight differences between them. So did you want to talk about that one? Absolutely.
So let's start with the 83. Honestly, I'm sorry, 78. Getting ahead of myself. The 78. This one, the trigger, I thought was fairly heavy.
Double action.
Yeah, the double action on that one. It definitely was very heavy. Now, if I think of it, comparing it to like a Chamelot-Delvigne, the Chamelot-Delvigne on this one are actually quite similar, but the Chamelot-Delvignes are much lighter, and in my opinion, comparing it to the 78 was actually smoother, which is interesting because maybe it's because there's so many springs there's this having to work against in here, but that trigger, it didn't feel quite as smooth as I would like it. It's still smooth, but you can feel it kind of like catching along the way, and you can even see it when I'm pulling it through.
I would say that there's a weird perceivable difference between a heavy single spring and multiple springs. There's sort of a drag that you start to feel when you have lots of interacting parts and lots of springs, because that surface area is really dialing up and the spring tension is coming from different directions.
And it's going to come in it's going to probably matter, but the single action's only got one spring in it, whereas the 86, thank you, it's got 2 springs in it. So maybe that's making a difference, but we're going to get into that in a moment, how that might be potentially different.
So we're fighting 4 springs. It's a fairly heavy pull, much heavier than, say, a Chamelot-Delvigne, which is a relatively appropriate gun for the time.
And then the single action, that was incredibly heavy. Why the heck is that single action so heavy? You can see my hand is shaking on that one. It almost makes no sense to me.
Now, I did a quick look in the gun. I don't see any obvious burrs, but she is correct. Whatever the catchment is for the single action, I don't know if... It may just be that deeply set for the seer, because to me, I can't find the problem that was creating it. I don't have another 78 to weigh in on.
But you agree with me too.
I initially thought that this gun had a burr. I've handled enough revolvers when I feel I cock the single action and I go to release that hammer and it comes up against this sort of lopey wall where it sort of flicks off and then it drops. That to me says burr. I couldn't find a burr. Maybe there's something I'm missing about the way this action works. I would love to get my hands on another one, but this particular one, if you watch the first shot of this entire episode, I'm sure a lot of people notice, you present that thing, and next thing you know, you are like shaking because you're exhausted, and you're coming up against, like an 8-pound brick wall in single action. It's bizarre.
So I thought it was just me because I really had just come off of the gassers and the gasser and the Montenegrins. Like I really had. So I was expecting... But to have a little bit of fatigue. But when I came up against that single action, I was like, there's something wrong here. And then I handled it the next day. No, I would like to try another example to see and compare it, but it is absolutely insane.
Yeah, it's crisp when it lets go, but it's boy heavy. Now, the other two, though, how are they doing in single action?
So I would say that the 83 with the single action on that one, I mean, of course, it's single action only, it's really smooth. It's really light. I have no ability to perceive whatsoever when it is going to go off. It was beautiful. It really quite was. It's unfortunate that this gun is single action only. I would like to see what it would have done in a double.
Well, you got to.
I mean, eventually I got to. But I'm just saying, like, when you handle something that beautiful, that smooth, that light, you want more.
I say the single most frustrating thing about this gun is when you get a hold of it and you're not always good at telling them apart when you're just sort of handling them on range and stuff, and you just start to pull the trigger, and it actually does. I mean, you can kind of see it'll torque the hand a little bit. Like you get just enough to flick the cylinder over. It feels like it's about to do something, and then you feel like there's some manual safety or something you're missing because it's not doing nothing. It's clicking. And so you keep expecting to have a nice double action in there. No, you got to go back and manually cock. Although I agree with Mae, this has a very, very smooth release on that single action.
Now, on to the 86 for our final one. Thank you. This one, it was the nicest trigger, I would say, out of all 3 of them. The double and the single on that one, don't get me wrong, they were still heavy for a trigger, I would say, but they were incredibly smooth. I really did like them. I thought that this was the best of the triggers, if I had to say, out of all 3 that I handled on range.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's no lope, there's no uneven spot, there's no hump. It's just a nice, well, it's not linear because you're rotating, but it's just this smooth engagement. It's a beautiful system. It's a simple system, and it works very, very well. It's just kind of heavy. I mean, they really do. Now, by the way, that heaviness is probably because when these guns came out, primer technology, don't forget, we're mid-1880s, but they're still using a lot of 1870s primers and old inventory and stuff like that. These guns are meant to really hammer those primers. Those were hard primers. So you have to dial up the spring tension to get that hammer to drop that fast. You could run this gun, if you put a new spring in this and just ran it with more modern primers, it would run fine with a much lighter spring. You could actually turn this gun into almost like a race gun revolver. I mean, you could get this gun running really light and really crisp with modern ammo just by changing out that one spring and setting down that spring tension. That's absolutely possible because the inside of this gun is modern. It is absolutely, the lockwork is a modern, acceptable revolver in this gun.
Well, without him getting too far down the weeds, you are forgetting that I need to talk about the hammer, sir.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, unfortunately, the 78 is not going to compare to the other 2 because there is no hammer rebound on this one, which means safety there, it's just not going to compare with the other two.
That's true. So if you want to open this guy up, you've got to sort of manually index back to that rebound position, whereas the rest of them are automatically going with a Warrant-style rebound, much safer.
I would agree. But yeah, realistically, those are just the biggest differences, I would say, between all three of these revolvers. The most perceivable differences.
It's all in the trigger and hammer.
Oh, yeah.
So your favorite?
I would say my favorite is definitely going to be the 86. It just had the best trigger control. I would say there was no perceivable difference between the recoil between all of them, so I'm not even going to bother with that one. But honestly, the trigger is what made that one for me, and it just felt the best in my hand too.
Now, would you say at the time that this gun came out, is there anything that is running smoother than it in terms of a trigger pull from some of the, we've handled like even stuff later, like the Bodeo stuff earlier, like the Chamelot-Delvigne, which has a lighter trigger, but is it smoother than this one?
Comparing the 86 to the Chamelot-Delvigne, I would say if the spring tension were the same, I would think the 86 would be better, me personally. But yeah, honestly, it was just surprising how smooth they really were. Again, I just wish the weight was a little bit different.
Okay. Now, while we're also contextualizing these, because I want to make sure people understand, 1878 through 1886 is when this is all developed, right? So in that same time frame, Germany released 2 handguns, both of which single-action only Reichsrevolvers.
And the Reichsrevolver, one of them was released a year after this one.
Yeah, and then the other one was released at the same time as the single-action only. So it's interesting because Germany is like, okay, we're going to shrink the Reichsrevolver. We'll have a single-action only Reichsrevolver that's smaller, the 83. Comes out the same year as this. Would you rather have a single-action Reichsrevolver 83, the smaller one, or would you rather have this?
I feel like nobody wins in this situation.
But true, but this is so much better.
That is better, don't get me wrong.
This is a human grip. Like, Belgium was kicking the snot out of Germany with their arms designs in the handgun department, but then again, the Reichsrevolver is just a nutty case to begin with.
Oh, yeah. But it's unfortunate that I just wish we had better options, I guess is my concern for World War I. But I guess we need to get into what's my favorite.
That's true.
Sorry, I suppose I should say, actually, that which one would I take into battle? So, as it stands, I would turn down the 78. I would, well, just obviously because it's got no hammer rebound, and realistically, choosing between the three, of course, the trigger is not quite as good. I just feel like it's not the right fit.
Let's go over it. Hold on. Let's clean this up a little bit. Let's talk about the faults that are indicative of all of these guns.
Okay.
So what hurts all of them?
Well, that's the heavy trigger. Like, the heavy trigger hurts all of them, and then the fact that I'm gate loading.
Right.
Gate loading, no matter what's going to kill all of them, and to a certain degree. It's going to bump all of them down to another level.
And then we're also dealing with a black powder cartridge.
That's true.
Sheer mass. And then as mild as that cartridge was, very high bore axis, so plenty of recoil.
So the recoil was significant, even though the cartridge wasn't even smokeless. That's amazing.
So you're going to get 6 shots of black powder and fairly decent recoil with low power, and you're not going to get a reload in on any of these. So that's almost a fail state for all of them.
I mean, if I'm up against 1 or 2 guys, sure, I could see them performing, with the exception of the single action. I'm probably going to die.
Okay, so the 83 is off the table.
Yeah, it just has to go, because single action is just never going to go.
Right, and then you said you had enough trigger problems with the 78, you don't like the rebound, that's off the table. So Let's get these out of the way. Let's get to the real crux. Let's hand you this one. In your heart of hearts, if you're taking that into battle in World War I, what kind of confidence are you having?
I would think, like I was saying before, I would think if I was up against maybe 1 or 2 guys, sure, I think I'd get my rounds off. But the problem is that when that number increases, then I'm having to look into reload for this. So, performance, it did well. It had no real faults for functioning by default, and it didn't give us any problems this particular example either. And the cartridge, while black powder, still wasn't too bad, I would say. I would give it just barely a yes. But the thing is that, honestly, if it wasn't a gate loader, if it was a swing-out cylinder, that would have made it really, quote, modern for its time, and that would make it, a decent yes in my book. Even though it's got this massive size to it and a heavy trigger, I would have bumped it into a better range for yeses. But as it is right now, with the gate loading, with the heavy trigger, I would honestly put it at a very mild yes.
Minimally acceptable risk. Okay, so anything else that you've said yes to, you would prefer to this. But this would still be above just garbage. Like, this is, you're not going to throw it away and try to grab the first thing you find on the next guy. You would have to actually see what he had before you stole it and all of the ammunition. Is that where we're going?
Pretty much. Although I will say, I wish there was one thing that they stole from the 83 and put on this one.
What, the bigger grip?
Yeah, no. It's got a little key in the grip down there at the bottom. So the grips are definitely, they're set in there. Whereas this one, there's a little bit of rollover on it. Just barely. But I wish they'd had a little key down at the bottom with it.
Yeah, it's interesting that the 83 does have a tab. And it's the only one that does. It has a tab that keeps the wood from being able to rotate once it gets a little bit loose. Although they may have found the problem is that with that tab, the grips could get a lot looser before you notice, and then they might take damage.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
So
okay,
it's hard to say. But I think that really does it, right? So the 86 is just the slimmest margin of passes for you. And honestly, as much as we're saying that they wouldn't be great in World War I, again, I want to point out, very advanced revolvers for their time. I mean, very close to being a modern revolver. And it's forgivable because even by the time of the 86, the swing-out cylinder is just being developed at that time. And so I don't know what else you could do to make that gun more advanced other than just sort of being a little psychic when it came out, because it's just that good of a design. And we're going to see it go into a whole other set of weapons in our next episode.
Ooh.
So hold on to your hats for 2 more weeks if you're watching live. If you're watching it later, you can go watch it whenever you want. But stay after the credits for any updates or any changes to what's going on with the show. And otherwise, thank you for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.
All right, folks, just a couple of things to note. Number one, there should be by now some shirts sitting over in the store. These were a bit of overflow. What happened is when we printed from the last round, we make a margin of error, and now that it's been a number of months, we're fairly certain we don't need our margin of error, so they can be bought. There was also some misprints where we had the wrong shirt on the wrong color, or the wrong design on the wrong color, so there's a few of those at the shop. Links down in the description. You guys know it's C&Rsenal.com. There's also the print shop and things like that over there. You can go surf through the whole thing. So grab some up, help sort of support the show. In addition, we've seen a general slowing down after Project Lightning because Project Lightning was very exciting, but we're back to our usual business. If you are enjoying the sort of procedural shows where we're going through everything in World War I, and then eventually when we leave World War I and we're going to go for a nice scatter shot method of whatever we happen to find, then maybe come support us on Patreon, make sure that the show remains viable, because I've noticed something very recently. I don't want to alarm anybody, but basically all of Anvil has been demonetized. Like, YouTube has very particularly not enjoyed that Mark has a screwdriver and a hammer, and so that is some lost income, and it especially benefited Mark. So if you want to support him as well, and you like the Anvil show, go over to Patreon/Anvil to support them directly. Or if you want to support sort of the whole network of what we're doing, just the regular C&Rsenal Patreon, that's backs Primer, and it will also back some future shows that we're hoping to put together. Whew. I guess I should probably say, if you are curious about what we're doing in a more personal manner, we do have a Discord up. It is not exclusive. However, there are rules, so please behave yourself. You can find that at the bottom of the main website. All right, guys, have a good one.